Hello, my name is Filippo Baldi. I'm a master's graduate in Global Management International Affairs. And today, here with us, we have Dean Vuletic, who is an historian of contemporary Europe and professor. He taught at the University of New York, Praga, and Vienna. Today, we are here to talk about the latest book, the Eurovision Song Contest, published in 2022 by Minimum Facts. So, Dean, could you tell us a little bit about why you decided to touch such a subject and write it as you did, dividing it in two parts? I read between 1956 and 1989, and then the second period. What was the method for this?
Thank you, Filippo, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak at this wonderful festival, which I think is very important for teaching us the value of Europe and of being Europeans. And that's something that Eurovision also teaches about. I wrote this book because there was no serious history of Eurovision available. You could find, let's say, popular insights into Eurovision books that looked into the voting or that talked about scandals or highlights of the contest, but nothing that really explained the political background of the contest, why it was established, and how it has managed to unite Europeans every year since 1956, unlike any other cultural phenomena. So that was the reason for me writing this book, and in order to complete my research, I delved into a lot of different broadcasting archives. I watched every single edition of Eurovision and analyzed every entry of the contest. The reason I divided the book into two parts, the first part being from 1956 to 1989, and the second from 1990 to 2016, is because essentially I focused first of all on the Cold War, and then I looked at the post-Cold War period, which has involved the expansion of the European Union.
Okay, thank you. So, with regards to the European Union, we know that Eurovision doesn't belong to the European Union, but has strong ties. What is your take on the possibility of the European Union using Eurovision as a tool for its cultural diplomacy?
Well, the European Union has already tried to do that. The first attempt happened in the late 1980s, and that was at a time when the European community, the forerunner of the European Union, was searching for ways to promote a European identity. Until then, the European community had been largely an economic organization, but in the 1980s, its officials came to believe that something like a European consciousness needed to be developed among the citizens of the European community. So they started to look for models, and one of those models was indeed the Eurovision Song Contest. And in the late 1980s, the European community even sponsored some editions of Eurovision by promoting, let's say, the European years through videos that were featured in the contest, or by sponsoring some of the postcards that are shown in the contest before the entries appear on stage. That only lasted until 1990, so until the Zagreb edition of Eurovision, when the European Year of Tourism was presented in the contest. But after that, the European Community and then the European Union never again sponsored Eurovision. The reason for this is because the European Broadcasting Union, the organizer of Eurovision, I think wanted to distance itself from the politics of the European Union because Eurovision has always had more members than the European Union. And associating yourself with the politics of the European Union can get tricky if you're not an institution of that organization, especially in recent years when we look at events like Brexit.
Obviously. Thank you.
And not to mention the expansion of the European Union to the east.
Obviously.
The European Broadcasting Union was actually the first Western European organization that expanded to the east.
Okay, perfect. And so if we take into consideration the last edition, 2022, it was obvious that a political message was cast. So, how much does the geopolitical situation of a certain participating country influence the outcome of the contest? And in your opinion, is it correct that one not only has to analyze the quality of the songs, which should be, I believe, the primary focus of the contest, but also analyze the political situation of the country? What is your take on that?
For me, Eurovision is fascinating because it is always staged in a political context. Whenever you have country states participating against each other, then things are bound to get political, and the contest has always been read politically as a result, especially the voting results. We know the phenomenon of voting blocks has existed in Eurovision since the early years of the contest, when they were especially motivated by linguistic alliances. These days, we can also see more political trends in the constitution, or the motivation behind these voting blocks. So I do think that we always have to interpret Eurovision politically, even though the European Broadcasting Union always says that this is not a political event. But Europeans love to watch it for the political messages that are sent through the entries, through the staging of the contest. I should point out that historically, having political and social messages in entries wasn't always such a prominent feature of the event. I would say that sending a certain message has been particularly apparent in the contest since Conchita Wurst won in 2014, the bearded Austrian drag queen who sent a lot of messages about the rights and visibility of sexual minorities in Europe. And since then, it has been somewhat of a fashion for songs to have some sort of socio-politically engaged message. But this wasn't always the case in Eurovision. It was more rare to find songs with a political message appearing in the contest before 2014, which is not to say that there weren't any. There certainly were several, perhaps the most prominent one among the winners being Toto Cotugno, who won Eurovision in 1990 in Zagreb with a song about European integration.
Thank you. And for my last question, I would like to ask, do you believe that the message that the Eurovision Song Contest wants to convey to the world has changed during the years? And how do you reckon the festival will change in the following years regarding especially a contrast between expansion and sending a European message of European culture?
Two great questions, Filippo. First of all, certainly the meaning of Eurovision has changed since its inception in 1956. In the 1950s, Eurovision was conceived as a technical experiment. Some people tend to put the beginnings of contemporary European integration and the beginning of Eurovision in the 1950s in the same basket, but this is really incorrect. The creators of Eurovision modeled it, first of all, on the Sanremo contest that was being staged by Rai in Italy since 1951. And they set it up as a technical experiment in television broadcasting, because in the 1950s, television services were nascent in European states, and these officials really wanted to test how much they could do with this new technology, whether they could broadcast simultaneously and live a program across several European countries. So the motivation behind Eurovision in its early years was really a technical one. In more recent years, the European Broadcasting Union has also come to infuse Eurovision with values, the values of inclusion, the values of diversity and openness. And so Eurovision has also developed in the context of this idea of European values. And in the years to come, I'm afraid to say, I think Eurovision, or at least the Eurovision brand, might be losing its Europeanness, because the brand is going global. The European Broadcasting Union is now expanding Eurovision to Latin America, There was an attempt to expand it to Asia, but this so far has not been successful. There's also a Eurovision Canada that's being produced. And this year we also saw the American Song Contest being staged for the first time on the Eurovision model. So this is now going global as a more commercial brand, which I think loses the real power of Eurovision, which is really bringing Europeans together on one night as the biggest cultural phenomenon to do so. This is a cultural reference that all Europeans can relate to, that all Europeans have an opinion on. When I've traveled around Europe to do my research around Eurovision, I was always fascinated by the different opinions I would get from people about Eurovision, whether they love it or hate it. It is something that brings together Europeans. This is its biggest value, and this is, I think, what most needs to be preserved about the contest, not any commercial dimension.
Thank you very much, Dean. I think that we will all look and see the next Eurovision contest with another lens, taking into consideration all the wonderful things that you just told us.
Thank you, and I hope to see Eurovision in Italy again soon.
We all hope that. We hope to have another winner very soon.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
this interview, Filippo, and it's a pleasure once again to be part of this festival.
Thank you so much for participating.